By this time, Les had left the house to go and share a flat with a mate of his, Curtis, who lived on Mayfield Street. Mayfield Street was off a Spring Bank, which, if the truth be told, wasn't a bank at all, and was actually open the whole year round. Unless by spring, it's meant to be a bank that just sort of leaps out at you. Maybe that's it. But the thing I remember most about Spring Bank was seeing all these kids from Harmer's College walking along there in their shorts, satchels and caps. Les used to call them Little Anguses and said that private schools were known for their love of AC/DC. AC/DC and biscuits, apparently. It's an odd combination, but according to Les, they have a bit of a tradition where they come together. Les, Curtis and Artez were trying to put a band together, which was a mixture of what they called progressive rock and funk music. They called it Stone Ferry, but it didn't last very long, 'cause none of them thought it was going to float. It was all a bit half-hearted anyway, 'cause even though Tez, who was living at lots of different addresses, always turned up with all of the music in his head and ready to play, he was getting more into Northern Soul nights, dancing and keeping the faith. Although you couldn't say that about the various women in his life. Les said Tez's love was definitely of the tainted variety. Les wasn't very focused either, and Mam suspected it was because he was growing something he shouldn't be. She said she wasn't worried though, 'cause as clever as Les was, he wouldn't get very far, as his lack of practical skills was chronic, and whatever he was doing, he'd make a hash of it. I was still getting the benefit of Les's fantastic knowledge, and he'd always try and teach me new stuff when he walked me home after visiting him. I remember one time he said something that really stuck with me. He said talent borrows, but genius steals. At the time, it sounded as though he'd just come up with it, but I'm pretty certain now he'd got it from somewhere else. Our Des, in the meantime, had joined a punk rock band, playing drums behind three girls called Gash. I think they were all from nice backgrounds, really, but even so, they changed their own names to horrible punky ones, like Anna Palindrome, who was on guitar, Beverly Westwood, who was on bass, and a singer called Patty Slapper. Although there's a lot to be said for being able to slap a decent patty, my life would be a lot poorer if it weren't for having the odd patty slapper in it. They wrote a lot of songs about what they called sexual politics, and I remember one of them called Is It In? Open brackets, 'cause I can't feel a thing, close brackets. They did an artsy film of themselves, wanging a welly at White Frigate. I don't know what it was they were trying to say, but on the strength of that performance, I'm not sure I'd want any of them wanging my welly. Not unless I fancied having it slapped continuously against the window of the old Marks and Spencer department store. And as for Uncle Sandy, he was being his usual cringy self, and now everybody in the house was having to suffer his cringiness as well, 'cause he'd gotten into CB radio and fancied himself a bit, what with all of the language that went with it, spending most of his time chatting in a pretend American accent to some bloke called Big Rubber Johnny. Although it did sound funny when Uncle Sandy was saying about Big Rubber Johnny being on his crotch rocket. Uncle Sandy called himself the caretaker, like he had some mysterious handle to do with being a gangster, when that's what he was, a school caretaker. I don't suppose he told his CB mates that, did he? Breaker 19, come in, Big Rubber Johnny, this here's the caretaker. I cleaned up some vomit in the school playground today. Do you copy? Yeah, we copy. Go easy on that sand bucket, good buddy. Dad was still in prison, of course, but not for long. Apparently, he got a chance to go on some sort of day trip and did a runner, knocking off a couple of places on the way, then turning up at hours in the middle of the night dressed like the milk tray man, looking to give Mam a pearl necklace, which, incidentally, turned out to be just paste. Unfortunately, Mam hadn't told Dad about Uncle Sandy, let alone the fact he lived with us, so Uncle Sandy was less than pleased to get an eyeful of Dad, pearl necklace, paste or otherwise. According to Mam, the fact that Dad had taken his clothes off and somehow managed to climb into bed and cuddle up to Uncle Sandy not only made Uncle Sandy wonder if he was being burgled, but also wonder if someone had pushed some kind of weapon into the small of his back, a prospect that caused him to stiffen, before deciding he was going to cross swords with the offender. Anyway, before you knew it, Mam said there were a couple of naked blokes fighting in the main bedroom, with Dad looking like he had a definite physical advantage, or as Mam put it, the bigger chap. In the end, Mam, who was no stranger to taking on one bloke, let alone two, ended up having to pull them both off. I mean, talk about having your hands full. The whole episode created such a commotion that one of the neighbours ended up calling the police, so you can imagine what that was like when they turned up. The whole street outside, watching as the police arrested what looked like a couple of late-night streakers, shoving them into the back of the van, whilst covering them both up with a couple of policemen's helmets. Of course, Uncle Sandy got let out pretty much straight away, and I dare say he had a decent story to tell his CB mates, knowing full well Big Rubber Johnny and his crotch rocket wouldn't be able to compete with being covered by a policeman's helmet, or a Smokey's Stetson, if you want to give it some sort of CB name. Mam said that looking back, she found the whole episode quite romantic, and was fond of telling people it was like a scene in a film called Women in Love, where Oliver Reed and Alan Bates fight with each other naked in front of the fire. But to my mind, Dad and Uncle Sandy probably looked more like Les Kellett and Mick McManus, without their trunks on. But I didn't say that, because that would make Mam look like one of those daft old biddies who used to get really worked up watching them, or in her case, like the referee who gets in the middle of the two of them and ends up getting a face wash.